On this episode, we'll be delving into the world of raw materials policy, in particular discussing the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act and UNFC's integration within it.
Joining us on this episode is Vitor Correia, the Secretary General of the International Raw Materials Observatory and part of the UN Expert Group on Resource Management, previously past President of the European Federation of Geologists. Welcome, Vitor. It's great to have you on the show with us today.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you also for the kind introduction.
Well, it's a very impressive list of credentials. Perhaps, would you be able to give us a little bit of an introduction to your experience within the wonderful world of minerals policy, about what INTRAW is and your role in the organisation, and also within that UN expert group?
Yes, of course. So the International Raw Materials Observatory, the short name is INTRAW, was created as a spin-off from a Horizon 2020 project that started in 2014. And in that project, the goal was to look to best practice in 5 countries. So in Australia, Canada, Japan, the US, and South Africa. And we were looking to the best practice in the raw materials domain. So we are looking to exploration, we were looking to extraction, we were looking to processing. And the idea was to convey some messages to the European Union on basically on the benchmarks that we could use also in Europe. At the end of the project, the partners decided, okay, what we have now is it's a sort of a nice digest of ideas. We should continue. And then we created the observatory as a not-for-profit organization. It is based in Brussels. And the main goal is to provide intelligence and information for policymaking. And of course, we are also very much, let's say, engaged in scenarios and having some sort of long-term view of the mineral raw materials world. So we are here just basically to provide support to organizations. We are completely neutral, and we like to position ourselves as honest brokers. And we are international, as I've been based in Brussels. But the fact is that we have many connections and we have many contacts with colleagues from all over. And these are relevant because, as you know, and this is something that I believe most people working in geosciences is aware, we don't have frontiers. I mean, you don't have clear divisions when you are talking about minerals. Some mineral deposits only exist in specific locations. So we really need to have this sort of international cooperation to go forward. And that's INTRAW. From my background, what you also mentioned with the United Nations expert group on resources management, that started when I was serving as president of the European Federation of Geologists. And the UNFC, so the United Nations Framework Classification, was being developed. And basically, they had a big group of people, nearly 100 people that were supporting that effort. And we have been there since.
What is your sort of thoughts on the aims of the CRMA in this case? And what do you think are the sort of parts that are the most important to you?
It should be emphasized that the CRMA, which was approved in 2024, in April 2024, it's a regulation, but it didn't start there. In fact, the European Union started looking to critical raw materials or to raw materials in 2008 with something that was the Raw Materials Initiative. And that initiative back in 2008, that was really shortly before the incident, the first incident between Japan and China, the so-called Senkaku incident, where a boat collision basically triggered China to block rare earth exports to Japan. And for that reason, there was a peak in the price of rare earths, and that was a sort of alarm to policymakers all over the world, including in Europe, to start looking to these supply chains. Because with globalization, what we had was a sort of the approach was with open trade, and of course, because sometimes you have the best deposits are not necessarily located where you are, so it makes sense to obtain copper perhaps from South America instead of extracting copper in Europe. So the globalization was in fact an enabler for this open trade. And what happened was, with that, of course, the supply chains became more dispersed, and that created new challenges. And of course, if there is some sort of blocks in a way that prevent trade to be completely free and open, that raises issues and concerns. And that was the case with the Senkaku boat incident. And of course, that triggered many policymakers, not only in the European Union, but also in the US, to start looking to supply chains. So 2008 was the start. In 2011, the European Commission started making every 3 years an assessment of the criticality. So how dependent are we on some minerals? And these criticality assessments, they provide a list of elements or materials that we really rely on. And in 2024, when the Critical Raw Materials Act was basically launched, so when the directive was created, it was basically to in a condition where in Europe we realize that we really need to have access to these raw materials, because the situation today, it's worse than it has ever been. I mean, we're depending in a few countries for most of these supplies, and these materials are really important for the energy transition and also for the European defense. So if you are talking about European autonomy, we really depend on raw materials which we don't extract or process in Europe. So the Raw Materials Act was basically a tool that is highlighting the need for having these materials or having access to these materials.
I think that's brilliant overview, and it's so important to have that context. Thanks, Vitor, because naturally we're talking on this podcast so much about the Critical Raw Materials Act, but not everybody's really familiar about what's gone on within Europe in why it's been formed. That's such a great overview. We've of course seen similar things over with the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States as well. We've seen a pivot in the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly through changes in administration in the US. This week, President Ursula von der Leyen gave a speech at the EP talking about the Resource EU plan and kind of bolstering this element of the Critical Raw Materials Act and that discussion of kind of domestic resilience and in that supply chain and sourcing as well. Do you feel that launch changes anything that's currently within the Critical Raw Materials Act, or does it change any of the content, any of the specific aims and targets, or does it just sort of bolster it or even shift to a different emphasis of what's already in that plan?
Yeah, that's a very good question. My perception is that, in fact, this plan, the announcement of the plan, so of the Resource EU plan, it's a political move, and it's a sort of reaction to the recent transactional move between Trump and of course, the China blockade on rare earth exports. So it's more of a political move. Of course, it shows that raw materials are very high in the political agenda, and that's important. But I believe that mostly, if you look to the reasons why we don't have minerals extraction or minerals processing in Europe, they are not difficult to understand. First, going back to the 70s, so we realized that it might be easier to extract these minerals where the deposits are better or where it's cheaper to produce them, and that basically justifies the displacement of mining to other places outside Europe. And with time, we lost memory of mining, so there is a sort of lost link. So most people does not realize that the metals and the goods that we are using every day, they need to be mined for most cases. And that disconnect justifies this idea that mining is bad. First, the second point that is relevant here is, why don't we have processing in Europe? Because you could be importing the ores and processing and transforming them in Europe. And the reason for that is also clear. It's the energy cost. If you compare the energy cost in Europe against the energy cost in China, it's clear that with the higher energy costs, and processing is normally a very energy-intensive activity, it's very difficult to have feasible, from the economic perspective, operations in Europe. So we don't have mining and we don't have processing. And now it's difficult to reopen mines or to open new mines because you have a strong public opposition. And that's good because we live in democratic environments in Europe. And for the sake of democracy, people is free to protest and to say we don't want that. So the question now, I believe, is how can we talk with people? How can we establish dialogues that would enable mining, especially in places where we have the mineral deposits? Also important to underline, because when we are talking about the critical raw materials list, we are talking about materials that in most cases are extracted and used in small quantities. There are a few exceptions like aluminium or copper. We use a lot of aluminium and a lot of copper, but it's not comparable to iron ore. We use much more iron. The problem with these small markets is that sometimes prices can be manipulated. So if we are talking about germanium or gallium or these elements that are in the list, the amounts that we are using at the global level are small, and most processing is coming from one country. So that country can, at any moment in time, just to increase the prices. And if they increase the prices, everyone is struggling because everything will be more expensive and the energy is racing. Or they can simply lower the prices. And when they lower the prices, all the mining projects that were about to open elsewhere won't be feasible anymore. So they basically, using this sort of dumping approach, they can control the market. And that's also a problem. So the main two problems are public opposition. So Europeans do not want mining projects. And on the other hand, you don't have investors because the markets are small and the market prices might be prone to manipulation. And with these market prices, then there is no investment that survives. So that's, I believe, the main challenges that we are facing now in Europe.
Yeah, I think that's such a succinct overview of kind of exactly that policy and international diplomacy legacy that's carrying on now within the mining value chain. And it's really difficult because I think also a lot of, when anybody first gets involved in the minerals conversation, you're not necessarily familiar with the value chain of going from finding a potential ore body to actually having it involved in a product that we use in everyday life. And you touched on the difference between having an active mining project and then processing. And I'm sure plenty of the people listening to this podcast, but not necessarily everyone will be familiar with all of the different stages from exploration development to extraction and then processing refinement that go on before we actually start. Thank you so much for such a comprehensive overview there. Alex, I know that you're chomping at the bit, particularly having talked about kind of the aims of the CRMA and those targets, to talk about some of those timelines. So I'll pass to you.
I think you've just already partly answered my question about, I was going to ask, what are these biggest barriers to overcome? And you mentioned sort of public opposition and investors. You've also highlighted the importance of the deadline, the timeline to the CRMA. How do you think that these barriers can be overcome, and how do you think these timelines can be met?
The timelines, you are mentioning the timelines for the strategic projects, because the Critical Raw Materials Act has this idea that some projects that are dealing with materials in that critical raw materials list will be deemed or will be tagged as strategic because of the location, because of the importance, the size of the deposit, all these things. And then you have these targets saying we should have, for instance, 10% of domestic extraction, or we should have 40% of these materials processed in Europe, and there is also a target for recycling of 15% of these materials should be coming from recycling operations. And for the strategic projects and for the permitting of this strategic project, there is a short timeline, a sort of speedway that would enable them to be, let's say, faster permitted, and then the extraction could start as soon as possible. That was the idea. But again, remember, we live in democracies in Europe, and we have courts. What we are seeing these days is that either you have public opposition to the projects, and that applies to most projects that are in what we called greenfields, meaning that projects that are basically located in areas without previous mining. Or if you are talking about brownfield projects or projects that are located in areas with existing mining operations, these ones can and will, in principle, happen. The problem with the greenfield projects is that not only you have public opposition, but you also have in some authorities, in some permitting authorities, we don't have people. I mean, these are complex projects, and you need to combine the environmental impact dimension, you need to combine the economic dimension, you need to combine the social dimension, and of course you also have the legal dimensions and the different jurisdictions. And sometimes permitting authorities, they don't have the skills, or they don't have the personnel with skills. And that's another layer of trouble. It's another complication that we are facing in Europe. Of course, it's not the same in all countries, but remember, we have countries in Europe without mining activity and metal mining activity for quite a few years, and most countries in Europe don't have an active new mine for decades. Look at the case of Portugal. You don't have a new permit for a mine for almost 40 years for a metal mine. So that shows you the size of the challenge. Also important to say that in some cases the universities, I mean mining engineers, geologists, all these professions are now facing shortages. In Europe, we see that universities do not get students on board, but if you compare that with Asia or China, it's quite the opposite. They are having thousands of students. I mean, once I went to China to give a talk, and I was impressed because it was more than 1,000 geology students, and it's like this in one room, and it looks like the size of all geology students in Europe, in one city, in Chengdu. So that it's a big difference.
It's one big lecture theatre for sure.
Yeah, of course, it was an international conference, a big lecture theatre indeed.
There are big challenges to overcome within the Critical Raw Materials Act, but then again, that's the purpose of big European policy. You touched explicitly on strategic projects element, and that's something I know that we'll talk about a lot on the podcast all the way through every episode. Do you mind just kind of giving us a quick overview of what a strategic project is, what their purpose are, and you kind of mentioned that expedited timeline. Would you mind giving us kind of an idea of how fast, but also maybe how much faster that is than usual within Europe?
It's much faster than usual, that's for sure. I must confess I'm not really keen on the exact timelines, but I can give you a sort of idea. If you look to the current status, you realize that having a new permit for a mine, it will probably take you like 10 years, which, by the way, it's not something I would say rare. If you look to the US, it also takes 10 years. And again, going back to the beginning of the conversation, when I mentioned that we were looking to benchmarks and best practice all over the world, we realized that for investors, one of the most important things is the stability of the regulation, meaning that investors don't like jurisdictions or countries where regulations are being changed or updated every few years. And the US is a good example because they have you're having a mining regulation that was, I believe, 6 decades old, more than 60 years old, and people enjoy that. That provides a sort of stability. They know that having a new permit, it might take 10 years because it has all these procedures and steps, but that was fine. What investors don't like is adding changes, because a new regulation means that you need to adapt and you really don't know what you can count on. Now talking about the strategic projects. Indeed, the assessment for a project to be considered strategic was using the United Nations Framework Classification, the so-called UNFC. And these projects that were considered strategic, that they will be having a sort of streamlined permitting process, a faster way, and I believe the delay was reducing to something like 18 to 20 months. So basically, we are talking about 2 years instead of 10 years, and 2 years everything included. So that might look fine. We can say, okay, that solves the problem. But remember, if you are facing public opposition, people still ask courts. And if you don't have investors, you might have a permit, but then you don't have an investor. So in my opinion, this is not sufficient because the two main issues that we are facing, permitting and investment, are not addressed. It must, if I may, I also would like to underline something that it's not clear to everyone. And we are talking about the announcement of the Resource EU project by Mrs. von der Leyen last Saturday. It just happens that the European Commission does not issue a unique permit. I mean, Brussels is not a permitting authority. So the ones who issue the permits are the country authorities and the regional authorities. So if you are talking about land use management, in most cases in Europe, this is made at the municipality level. If the land use plan does not allow for a mine, we have a problem. And then the permit is, in most cases, it's issued by the regional or by the central government. And these governments, they might be aligned with Brussels, but remember, this is not the case sometimes for the local government or for the municipality, because there is a sort of disconnect again. We have, let's say, a fair understanding of the need for the raw materials at the Brussels level, at the government level. We need that for the energy transition, we need that for the European autonomy, but then at the local level, the people living in that small community, they don't care about that. What they see is that, okay, we are the guys that will be sacrificed and our environment will be sacrificed in order for some German car plant or some guys in Sweden have nice battery plants and factories and all. I mean, that's the narrative. And that's not easy to change, yeah.
And I definitely want to ask you about the public perception piece, because I think you've highlighted there, the real scalability and kind of regional or scalability of this challenge. It's an EU piece of legislation, but we're talking about impacts that are very localized to specific communities, and that's challenging. But before we go to that, you talked about the permitting then, and there's going to be no EU permitting centralized thing. It's going to be municipality or jurisdictional. There have been conversations within the European Parliament about, making sure strategic projects are successful is an underlying credential to the Critical Raw Materials Act, in terms of these are the flagship kind of projects, or at least that's how they're viewed by external stakeholders quite regularly. Do you see that disconnect between the EU legislation and the actual ability to sign permitting procedures on the dotted line? It could lead to a bit of a derailment there, and do you think that there are any areas where we look like people are successfully collaborating to overcome that already, or is this something we're just going to have to see how it plays out?
Yes, definitely. I believe this is the bigger risk that we are facing now, this sort of disconnect, because it's clear that, first, starting with the name of strategic project, if a strategic project is deemed as strategic, that could, and if you know that, imagine that you provide or 100 projects were basically assessed and 20 were classified as strategic. That says that the other 80 are not good projects, at least to the, let's say, to the regular public, to the lay people. And that's not necessarily a good image, because sometimes the so-called classification of or the tagging this project as strategic, it follows I would say a very narrow and specific procedure, which does not include everything. Let me give you an example. So the UNFC is looking to the social, environmental, and economic performance of a project, and when the classification was designed, it was useful to compare also different types of projects, not necessarily mining projects against each other, but also, let's say, a oil and gas project against a mining project, or a renewable energy project like a dam, an hydropower project against a mining project, or against any other type of project. So imagine, and that's useful for policy planners and regulators, because imagine that you have a place where you have a mineral deposit, but you also want to build a dam there. Of course, if you build a dam, the mine would be possible, but if you have the mine, the dam probably won't be feasible until 40 or 50 years from now. So for that type of decision-making process, it will be useful to have this classification, because you can compare on the environmental, social, and economic dimensions to the benefits of both projects, and you can compare. If you are just talking about mining, and again from the country perspective, if you are using the UNFC classification, that's also useful, because if you are managing your inventory, because you'll be having, imagine, in Portugal, you have several lithium deposits. Which deposits should be prioritized? Which one shall be, or which mines should be starting now, and which ones could be, let's say, delayed, or they are not so relevant, depending on the deposit, and there is different dimensions. Then the UNFC is very useful. You don't have any other tool to compare and to access that. But if you are comparing, now looking to the strategic projects, if you are using the UNFC as it is now, you might come to places or to solutions where, for instance, you are not looking to the impact of that project in the region, or even in Brussels, or at the country or at European level. And that's also very relevant, because we have many examples of projects that we call provided seed for development. I have a brilliant example from the south of Portugal from last century, beginning of the 20th century, when it was basically a project providing pyrite, and that pyrite enabled the construction of a sulfuric acid plant. In fact, the goal was, let's build a sulfuric acid plant. We need the mineral for that. We need to produce the sulfuric acid. So it was a pyrite mine that was providing the raw material. What's interesting in that story is that after having the sulfuric acid plant, the investors decided, let's have a fertilizers plant, because you need sulfuric acid. So if we import phosphates, we can break these chains and we can produce fertilizers. And then a few years later, they decide, okay, we are now producing fertilizers, but we are shipping the fertilizers, but we need to have the capacity to have our own ships. So let's have a shipyard. And that project enabled a shipyard. Of course, in between, they built a town, they built an hospital, they built schools and railroads, all that because of that mine was providing the critical raw materials. Now, many years later, almost 1 century later, the shipyard still stands, the mine is still operating, the fertilizer plant and the sulfuric acid, they don't exist anymore, but the hospital is one of the best private hospitals in Portugal. And the shipyard is one of the biggest shipyards. So the mine was a seed for development. And I believe this is something that we might also need to consider when we are talking to these new mines in Europe. So people are not aware that they might be a seed for development, but also policymakers. We need to have this broader image that mines can be, in fact, real contributors to not only local, but also to regional and national development. And this is very important. And it's missing in the discussions.
It's such an interesting point. A lot of, or some of the engagement work I've been involved in with certain mining entities globally, engaging external stakeholders, a key theme is actually, or a common theme, and again, this is all very specific to specific context, so it's not a one size fits all, but have been comments about an interest in regional infrastructure development rather than necessarily the local infrastructure development being the more appealing or interesting opportunity for those communities. And again, something that was perhaps immediately picked up on the day that the strategic projects announcement took place, because we were in the same place, we were both in Geneva at the UN, at their conference. Everybody clocked that there wasn't quite this value chain set up in a regional. The selection of strategic projects seems to be on a very case by case basis, and perhaps missed the opportunity for either regional clusters and development through kind of creating areas that could support each other, or through creating the stabilization of a key value chain. Do you think that, because that was quite vocal comment within in that room at least, do you think that's something that's fed back to the EU and could be implemented in the future? Or do you, and that's entirely speculation, no, or do you, or I guess, are you in agreement that maybe that's where we could look or should look in the future?
I believe that will happen in the future. Now, what we have is a sort of race against the time, against the clock, meaning that we are so stressed by time, and in a world that is so transactional with the new White House administration, and of course also China actions and the war, and I mean the Russian aggression against Ukraine, all these things combined put a lot of stress in the system. So we are running against the clock, and that the second call for strategic projects is out. Apparently, they are using the same assessment process, so things have not changed. But on the same time, I'm pretty sure that that sort of voice reach out to the people making decisions at the table in Brussels, and they realize that they need to incorporate, let's say, broader perspective. Otherwise, they won't have the support and the local support that it's needed. Without public support, these projects won't fly, and that's clear. I mean, we have a list of projects, and most of them, they are not having investors, or they don't have the permits yet. So, and even as I mentioned before, even if they have the permits, probably the investors won't be joining. So this is I believe, with time, and again, we don't have much time, but we need to proceed. Policymakers will start looking to the local administrations and to regional administration, and will start working together, because this is the only way forward.
And it's an exciting opportunity for essentially, a refocus on that common aim and goal, and particularly during times where, we are seeing quite disparate policy emerging in different nations and municipalities. So it's really exciting. You touched a few times on this, public perception, essentially. And, I think there is no public perception that's wrong. Everyone's very entitled to their own views, etc. But perhaps with mining and a value chain, that level of pre-existing knowledge, because it's not something I was ever educated about when I was going through education systems, isn't necessarily there. We've both been parts of projects in yourself, Saran, and ourselves, Vector, as EU Horizon research projects that have assessed these kind of environmental and social challenges with domestic resourcing of raw materials within Europe. Would you be able to kind of give us an overview of maybe, one, what Saran was as a project, and two, what some of those big findings on those challenges were, and how that aligns to that society perception, please?
Yes, certainly, Chris. But before, just let me mention something about public perception, which I believe is really important. Is that most people do not realize, as I mentioned before, that the goods, the tools that we use every day, they are coming from a mine. But there is also a sort of bias on the value of those goods. Just by accident, I had here a spoon because I had my tea before on my desk. If you look to one of these common tools, like one fork or a knife or a spoon, something like that, you realize that this is made of metal. And in most cases, it's a sort of steel. It probably has some nickel, and what most people do not realize is that the price that we are paying for this, this is probably less than €1, or it might be 60 cents or 70 cents. Well, it will be less than €1 at the store. It's not a fair price, because in order to have this, you have consumed huge amounts of energy. Probably some place in the world you have like 1 cubic meter all in the ground. You have all that huge amounts of water that are being used to produce that, and we are just paying €1 for that. Meaning that the economy that we have is geared in a way that we are, because we are so efficient in producing all these goods, that we are able to provide them at the store with very low prices, and people does not realize that there is a huge amount of work that was invested, and materials that was invested to produce these goods, and the value should be quite higher. There is an interesting project. It was made in the UK. I believe it's the Toaster project, and there is a TED talk about that. So it's a design student, and they try to build a toast from scratch. And they began by going to a shop, buying a toast by 20 euros or less than that, and then they dismantle that, and then they try to build up all those pieces. And it's an interesting TED talk. It basically makes people realize that what we are paying is far from being fair, and that creates a bias. So that's the beginning of that bias. Then talking about mining, as I mentioned before, we have brownfield and greenfield areas. This is the so-called technical term to places without mining operations or to places with active mining operations. We have, and this is now Sweden, we have monitored, because Sweden, to start, Sweden was about mining in environmentally protected areas. The reason why, in Europe, 85% of the known deposits of critical raw materials are located within or at less than 5 kilometers from an environmental protected area. So if we have already all these public opposition problems, now imagine that we are telling people that we have this environmental protected area and we need to open a new mine in there. That, of course, will create even bigger public opposition, not only from the local communities, but also from environmental protection groups. So that was the starting point. And we realized that we have already many mines in Europe that are active and operating inside natural parks or environmental protected areas. So it's possible. And more interestingly, these mines don't have public opposition. They have public local support. People are in favor of the mine, and they are performing very well with basically no environmental footprint. So that's possible. And then we were talking to these communities without active mining. So people, they have never been in touch with the mine. In principle, they are against mining. And we are asking them, under which conditions would you be open to have a new mine in this natural park or in this Natura 2000 area? And then we realized that there are three conditions. And the first one, I believe, is very, very important. So the people are saying, okay, the mineral or the raw material that you are extracting, it needs to be critical. And that's very important because it doesn't make sense. And I also agree with that. In my opinion, it doesn't make sense to have a gold mine inside a natural park, which, as someone said once, and I enjoy that, we are extracting gold from underground to put it in some vault underground again, but in a bank this time. So why the hell do we need it? It doesn't make sense to destroy an environmental park because of a gold mine. I subscribe that. So the mineral needs to be really important for the energy transition for the public good. The second important issue for most people is they don't want environmental impacts. And of course, we have already technologies, and we have many examples like the ones that I mentioned of mines that are operating inside environmental protected areas. So the technology exists. So the mine needs to be so-called invisible. It must be underground. The waste management must be using the best available technologies, no surface footprint and visibility. So that's possible. So the mine should be about the critical raw materials. It should be invisible without environmental impacts or minimal environmental impacts. And the third condition from these conversations was local communities must receive a fair share. And I believe this is where you need to draw a line between what is the local community expectations and what is the public good for us as Europeans, because we don't want to be depending on the United States or on Russia or on China. So if we want to be autonomous, we need raw materials, we need to extract and process them domestically. And for that, you need to have a line between what's the fair share that the community that is living closer to that mine or to that mineral deposit should receive from that common good. And this is an interesting discussion. And I believe that we came up with a tool that we call community development agreement, which is not new, but it sort of opens dialogue to settle a sort of agreement between the local community and what is possible for them for the project to provide.
No, I think that's really interesting, and it essentially gets to the crux of sustainability in what's referred to as a just transition, which is any form of transition which is it takes everybody on that journey and treats it rightfully, be it through the fact that we value materials in your spoon example and recognize that we might be paying less for it because it's materials that have come from a long way away. They might have a big impact on the land there, on the atmosphere and the CO2 getting it over here. All of that were communities paid fairly. And then the same with respect to how do we pivot and assess that within an EU domestic economy too? No communities. It very much so brings us back to the sustainability piece that's particularly close to my interest. Alex, I know that you're chomping at the bit to relate that to UNFC, so I'll hand over to you.
No, that's fine. No, because UNFC, obviously, you've already mentioned it, has this environmental, social, economic axis as one of its sort of core elements. Do you really think there's sort of the inclusion of UNFC with this axis, this category of environmental, social, and economic, can that actually help the mineral sector better engage with the environment, with people?
Alex, I'm going to be blunt on that. I believe it won't work. And the reason why, I believe UNFC is a useful tool for experts. So it makes sense for Chris, for you, for me to have a look at that, for people that is working on that classification of the strategic projects to use the UNFC. That's logical. It makes sense because they have a useful tool. But if you are approaching common people, lay people, and saying, okay, my project was labeled as strategic because I used the UNFC classification, and that's great. I mean, the UN has a value. I mean, the brand name has a value. But I believe that's not sufficient. I mean, again, when we are approaching people, some of the first, there are minerals that these days, the reputation of these minerals is so bad that even if the environmental impact of those mining types is not as bad, so the reputation of the mineral is the worse, and people don't listen to anything anymore. Lithium is a great case, especially in Portugal. I remember a colleague that was doing exploration for copper, and he was approaching a landowner and asking the landowner if he could go inside his land to make a geophysic assessment. And the landowner was asking, is it for lithium? And my colleague was saying, no, it's for copper. Considering that copper is much worse than lithium, because lithium is a silicate. I mean, from the environmental perspective, a lithium mine is much easier. It's like a quarry, basically. It's not comparable to the acid waters that you might have in a sulfide deposit of copper. So my colleague was concerned and said, it's for copper. But the reply from the landowner was, oh, that's good. For copper, that's fine. If it was for lithium, I won't allow you. So the reputation of some mineral is so bad, and that's part of the conversation. And there are many narratives, there are many false narratives. So if you are just using a new jargon or a new brand name like the UN and saying to communities, okay, but this project is using the UNFC, and of course we have measured all the social and environmental dimensions, and they go, what are you telling me about? I don't care about that. I care about the water level in my well. I care about the number of apples that I'm picking up from my trees or pears or whatever. This is what I want to count. These are my problems. I don't want the noise. I don't want the dust. So we need to work on that. And for that, of course, we need to work with the local community and also to bring the regional and the national levels, because these are the ones that issue the permits. And working with them is how can this project be a seed for regional and national development?
There's such an important point about that transparency. And again, what is the purpose of UNFC within the CRMA? So, okay, I fully agree with you. It's the same with if you walked up to a local stakeholder and started, flashing around your Crisco aligned report. Again, there's a technicality to it and there's a purpose to it. And I know that we've got the opportunity to speak to Ed Sides about that later as well in the podcast series with respect to who those reports are helpful for. When it comes to UNFC, though, again, perhaps not local stakeholders first port of call. There has always been a commentary about UNFC perhaps being written in the CRMA for maybe policymakers to be able to have a more transparent discussion about these value chains, about projects, about whole supply chains. Do you see it having an improvement in communication there so that we aren't trying to get, politicians or policymakers or advisors to engage with, JORC or 43, etc. aligned reports that are a bit more, even more technical? Do you see a benefit there, or do you still think it's not quite the right form of communication?
No, definitely. There is a benefit there. And that's clear because I remember before the Critical Raw Materials Act being published, there was a sort of competition between these reporting systems, Quisco line, you mentioned PERC, but also JORC and others, the Canadian NI 43101. I mean, you have several. It looked like a competition between these existing reporting systems that were designed for investors and for stock market, for companies that are publicly listed, and for investors to know that deposit really exists. So if I'm putting my money, or if you are a pensions fund or whatever, even if you have a big institutional investors, if you are putting the money of the people that you are representing in that project, you are not taking additional risks, because in the past we had these sort of problems. So that's useful for that. And then it looked like a race because the UNFC was also being considered to be mentioned in the Critical Raw Materials Act. And some people, especially in the industry, were saying, okay, that's a duplication for us because we need to use for the investors the other Crisco line codes, and then for the policymakers in Brussels, for our project to be evaluated and considered strategic, we also need to use the UNFC. And then we had many conversations, and I've been engaged in a few between the UNFC officers and between the Crisco experts, and they came to the conclusion that these are complementary tools, because at the project level, what the Crisco line codes provide is a lot of details that it's a granularity that you cannot have with UNFC. And at the country level, what the UNFC provides is as I mentioned before, it's a tool for inventory management that the project cannot provide. So from the European perspective, it makes complete sense to use the UNFC, because if you want as a policymaker to know exactly what are the mineral deposits, again lithium, that we have in Europe, then the UNFC is the best tool, because it also takes in consideration projects or deposits that might not be economically feasible today, which for the other reporting codes are not even, they don't exist. If it's not feasible, it's out of the scope. And that's very relevant.
That's a perfect note to end on as well there, with that UNFC acting as a translation tool to bring those stakeholders together so that we can engage people that we've traditionally struggled to in these conversations. And like you say, have that future looking perspective with respect to shoring up economies and supply chains, and not being reliant on tools that are so founded in the present that perhaps we are missing other opportunities. I think from our end, nothing but a massive thank you to yourself, Vitor, for appearing on the podcast. We really appreciate it. What a way to kick off the series of episodes. And we hope that anybody listening will have enjoyed learning from Vitor just as much as we did, and look forward to joining us on this journey of UNFC and the Critical Raw Materials Act. Thanks, Vitor.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a big pleasure. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Alex.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by guests or contributors on the podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, Satarla and Critical Productions. Any statements made should not be interpreted as endorsements or official positions. Listener discretion is advised.